Kremlin's line to always try to limit international support for Ukraine, especially military support, is no, if you do that, we'll come after you. We'll come after you. We've got our
Putin's
shiny
red
missiles as
lines.
well.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that what David Lammy was doing was setting up a second layer here, a reason to say, look, let's get past the Kremlin's propaganda and say how the situation might have changed here. And that is, yes, there is a further escalation in that Iran, which has been supporting Russia for many months with these attack drones that kill Ukraine civilians, now are providing the ballistic missiles that could kill even more.
We've been hearing from the news with Cara. Britain and the United States are on the verge of allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles against targets in Russia after accusing President Putin of escalating the conflict by accepting ballistic missiles from Iran. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, were speaking yesterday. They met with Zelensky. Tomorrow, the Prime Minister meets with Joe Biden. Here to tell us more, Scott Lucas is the Professor of American Studies, a specialist in US and British foreign policy. Scott, good morning.
Morning to you, Rosie.
I would say the conversation has shifted quite significantly this week.
It may have shifted, Rosie. There is a pattern here in which, in the Biden administration, Secretary of State Blinken has been out front at times of other officials in saying this may be possible. That was true back in April when the U.S. finally decided to deliver these long-range, what are called ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. Now, Blinken appears to be out front by saying, okay, we are considering the permission for you to use those long-range missiles on strategic targets inside Russia, which Ukraine has been pushing for ever since the spring, for many months. I think what is equally significant is that you're also seeing David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, yesterday indicate that Britain may be giving permission for its Storm Shadows, which were delivered even before the American versions went to Kyiv, inside Russia. And some British officials, and I must emphasize just some British officials, telling media outlets that that permission has been given for the use of those missiles, even though it will not be publicly announced by Keir Starmer at the meeting with Joe Biden on Friday.
The fear has always been about escalation. I wonder what you make of David Lammy's analysis, our Foreign Secretary, by saying if anyone's taking escalatory action, it would appear to be Mr. Putin and Russia. Zelensky said that. But our Foreign Secretary had said, when we look at Iran's involvement in the last few days, he says that in itself is an escalation.
Yeah, so let's break this down into two stages. The first stage is that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is saying, what is obvious and essential, and that is that the fundamental escalation of this conflict was when Vladimir Putin decided to send in all of those troops in a full-scale attempt to try to conquer Ukraine back in February 2022. Now, he's failed to do that, but the onus is on him. What happens is that the Kremlin's line to always try to limit international support for Ukraine, especially military support, is no, if you do that, we'll come after you. We'll come after you. We've got
Putin's
our shiny
red
missiles
lines.
as well.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that what David Lammy was doing was setting up a second layer here, a reason to say, look, let's get past the Kremlin's propaganda and say how the situation might have changed here. And that is, yes, there is a further escalation in that Iran, which has been supporting Russia for many months with these attack drones that kill Ukraine civilians, now are providing the ballistic missiles that could kill even more.
Yeah. What we're hearing, the Times analysis this morning, is that the UK has privately supported the idea of Ukraine using these long-range weapons, but they haven't been able to bring the Americans on side because many parts of the US administration have sort of changed their view, but actually the person who's yet to be convinced is the American president.
Weeks ago, this was the case. This is not new in that those British officials were already letting it be known. As Ukraine moved into Western Russia in what's called the Kursk offensive, but as Russia maintains its own offensive to try to seize the eastern part of Ukraine, those British officials said, look, we are ready to lift the ban on the use of long-range missiles, but we need the Americans to consent because we're in this invasion together, and the Americans weren't doing so. Whether or not it was Joe Biden at that time, Joe Biden now, not yet confirmed, but it is quite clear that London is in front of Washington on this issue. And I think, as we have seen going all the way back to the question of the provision of tanks, to the question of the provision of warplanes, that once again, you'll see the UK being out front. You'll probably see the Storm Shadows being used in Russia, and then the Americans will allow the ATACMS to also be used in Ukrainian military operations.
If it plays out like that, we will see. Scott, thank you very much for your analysis. Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies, a specialist in US and British foreign policy. We'll hear much more tomorrow when the Prime Minister meets with Joe Biden, and we'll have coverage of that for you here on Times Radio. 5:46, ahead of the business news, we get a little bit of a glimpse of an unusual show as London Fashion Week kicks off.
Thank you very, very much, and it's always so good to see you and to see all of our colleagues. I'm delighted particularly to be here with David. The United States, the United Kingdom, united for Ukraine. And not just our two countries, dozens of other countries that continue to support Ukraine's success, Ukraine's victory.
Thank you for this participation, and of course, using this opportunity, I want to discuss with you.
This is the first time in well over a decade that a Secretary of State from the US and a Foreign Secretary in the UK have traveled together, and that is to reiterate our complete support for the Ukrainian struggle, to hear, to listen, to strategize on the coming months with our determination